In our last lesson, we talked about conjunct and disjunct movement, and those have to do with the horizontal aspect of music, the melody. But now we're going to talk about the distances between notes from a vertical standpoint. So the intervals that we use in conjunction with the harmony. And more specifically, the intervals that we use at rhythmic changes in the music. So for instance, if we have a group of mostly eighth notes, except for the spot where there's a dotted eighth and a 16th note, that's a rhythmic change and it's more noticeable, so that's what we're going to give consideration to as far as what intervals we can use and when. So I've categorized the different intervals into three groups. The first, group number one, these are the primary consonance intervals, and these include the major and minor thirds and the major and minor sixths. So these we use liberally, and we should, because they're the most harmonious of the intervals. The only word of caution is not to use them too much, because if we think about what counterpoint is, it's the use of simultaneous independent melodies. So if we have multiple melodies, all separated by a major third, and they continue to be separated by that distance, after a while it no longer sounds like different melodies, but rather like one melody. So because of the harmonious nature of the thirds and sixths, we limit the use to maybe 4 or 5 repetitions, and we use our judgment as far as which. But that's really the only law as far as using the group number one. As far as group number two, these are the secondary consonance intervals, and this includes the perfect eighth, perfect fifth, and perfect fourth. Now these can be used fairly liberally, but we don't want to use them in succession with one another or interchange them. So what that means is that if we have two melodies that are separated at that rhythmic change by a perfect fifth, we don't want to follow that with another separation of a perfect fifth. We also don't want to interchange it with an eighth, so we wouldn't have two melodies separated by a fifth and then separated by an eighth. We would go back to group number one, back to the thirds and sixths. And then the other rule regarding our group number two is not to approach those intervals from parallel direction. So if we have two melodies that are both going in an ascending manner, we would want to change direction with one of them before approaching that interval. Now we come to our third group. This is the dissonances, and this takes the most skill and thought to be effective in their use, and so we're going to spend more time on this group. Just to list the majority of them, but it's not an exhaustive list. It includes the diminished fifth, diminished seventh, the augmented second, the minor seventh, and the major second. Now, in music, intervals oftentimes have multiple names. So the diminished fifth, which I'll go ahead and play an example of, sounds bad, right? So we might be wondering, first of all, why are we examining the diminished fifth as an option for an interval? Secondly, the diminished fifth, if we contrast it and compare it with the augmented fourth, built on the same note, here's the diminished fifth, and here's the augmented fourth. So it's the same interval. Why do we call it two different things, and why are we excluding the augmented fourth from an acceptable interval? Well, there's two ways of examining the difference between the two. The first is a simple method, just by looking at the letter names of the notes being involved. An example of this would be that interval again. If the notes are B and F, that's a diminished fifth, not an augmented fourth. And the way that you can do that is just by counting the notes, B, C, D, E, F. So that's 5. In order for it to be an augmented fourth, it technically has to be those two notes, C flat and F, or B and E sharp. And now the second and the more important difference between the two is the structure, or the harmonic structure that it's part of. So in dominant harmony we have the dominant 7th chord. In C this would be the G7, which very common progression, maybe arguably the most commonly used progression in music. But we find that within that chord, if we take away the G and the D, that's part of it. So when it's part of the dominant 7th harmony, it's acceptable to use a diminished 5th interval. And we don't find an augmented 4th in the dominant 7th because it's built with the dominant triad, B, D, and G, and then a lowered 7th, which is F, not E sharp, being lowered from F sharp. So in that instance, we can use the diminished 5th interval if it's part of the dominant 7 harmony. Now, it's very important that whenever we have one of these temporary harmonies, we always want to resolve it, because it's basically a transition into a more stable harmony. The second example, this is the only other one we're going to consider in depth, but this is the diminished 7th. The diminished 7th is also known, or the same notes could be considered a major 6th, which might raise the question then, why is the major 6th in group number 1 but the diminished 7th in group number 3 where caution is exercised? Well, I'll give an example. That is a diminished 7th, and it's also a major 6th, those two notes. But going back to dominant harmony, if we were to play a major or a dominant 9th chord, which is essentially a dominant 7th with an added lowered ninth, with, we commonly hear one or two of the notes of that chord being cut out, but essentially that's what it is. And so if it's a 9th, in the key of G, it would be the A being lowered to A flat. Now, A flat and B both occurring in that harmony, that would be a diminished 7th and not a major 6th. For it to be a major 6th, it would have to be B and G sharp, which stands on its own because it's generally part of either a G sharp minor chord or an E major chord, those two notes. So when we're using those two notes, the A flat and the B, and of course we can transpose this into any key, but the diminished 7th is acceptable when part of the dominant 9th harmony. And then using that principle, go ahead on your own and look at these other examples and figure out what functions they would serve where they would be acceptable using the principles of dominant harmony. Now, as far as the rules of our use of these dissonances, first of all, we don't want to introduce them abruptly. We don't want to approach by a leap. And then the same rule applies as with group number 2. We don't use more than one in a succession, and we don't interchange them. We would go back to group number 1, or occasionally group number 2, depending on how it fits in our scope. So hopefully that's helped, and next we will examine the construction of a 4-voice fugue.